Emily's hands trembled violently as she stared at the bottle of pills. 2 hours of sleep in 3 days. The exhaustion was crushing her, but the hospital bills were crushing her mother even more. This cleaning job at Meridian Tower was her last hope, and falling asleep in the CEO's chair could end everything. The security footage would already show her transgression. She had exactly 17 minutes until Alexander Harrington would arrive for his 5 a.m. meeting ritual. 17 minutes to decide, face him or flee forever. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Too late. Alexander Harrington stood before her, his steel-gray eyes widening at the sight of her frozen in his chair. Emily felt her world collapsing. This job was everything: rent, her mother's medication, food. The renowned tech billionaire was infamous for his exacting standards and clinical obsessive-compulsive disorder. The business magazines called him the machine for his precision and detachment. His employees called him much worse. "You were sleeping in my chair." His voice was unnervingly calm, head tilting slightly as he studied her. "No one touches my things. Ever." Alexander's fingers twitched at his sides, a telltale sign of his OCD flaring. What Emily couldn't understand was why he wasn't immediately firing her. Instead, he was watching her with unsettling intensity, as though she were a complex equation he couldn't solve. "Tell me why I shouldn't call security right now." Emily's throat went dry. "My mother has leukemia," she blurted, surprising herself with the truth. "I work 3 jobs. I haven't slept in days. I sat down for a minute and," she stopped, realizing excuses wouldn't matter to a man worth billions. "I'll clean everything. Twice. With whatever disinfectant you prefer." She reached for her cleaning cart, already imagining the impossible task of finding new work with this termination on her record. Alexander's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. "Stop," he commanded. "My chair requires specific cleaning protocols. You'll make it worse." He stepped closer, inspecting her with clinical detachment. 3 jobs and a sick mother. Interesting. The word hung between them like a question. For the first time in years, Alexander Harrington felt something crack in the perfect routine of his life. Without warning, he unlocked his desk drawer and removed a small leather-bound notebook. "I need an assistant who isn't afraid of me. Someone who can organize chaos without creating more. Someone who understands." He hesitated. "Precision." He extended the notebook. "This contains my daily protocols. Memorize them. You start tomorrow. The salary is triple what you make cleaning." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you trust me? I fell asleep in your chair." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Because you told me the truth when lying would have been easier. And because people who understand desperate circumstances don't waste opportunities." His expression darkened. "Don't make me regret this, Emily Lewis." She hadn't told him her name. 3 weeks into her new position, Emily was beginning to understand the complex machinery that was Alexander Harrington's life. His OCD wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about control. Every minute of his day was scheduled, every interaction choreographed, every decision filtered through elaborate protocols designed to maximize efficiency and minimize human unpredictability. "You moved my water bottle 2 centimeters to the left," Alexander said without looking up from his computer. The morning sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the tense set of his shoulders. Emily nodded. "Because the condensation was going to damage the financial reports. I noted it in the daily log as per Protocol 7. Alexander's typing paused. He looked up, surprise briefly visible before his features settled back into their usual mask. "You're learning." "That's what you're paying me for," Emily replied, allowing herself a small smile. "Though I'm still trying to understand why someone who hates disorder hired a person he found sleeping in his chair." "Perhaps I recognized a worthy adversary," he said, his tone so dry Emily almost missed the joke. Almost. Their days fell into a rhythm, Alexander creating order, Emily adapting to it while gently pushing its boundaries. He began to rely on her understanding of his needs without judgment, while she found unexpected stability in his structured world. Neither mentioned the growing current of something else beneath their professional exchanges. Then came the night everything changed. A critical server failure required Alexander's immediate attention at 2 a.m. Emily arrived at the office to find him in rare form, tie loosened, hair disheveled, eyes wild with the particular panic that only disrupted routines could trigger in him. "I can't think," he muttered, pacing the length of his office. "The patterns aren't connecting. Too many variables." His breathing was becoming erratic, the beginning of a panic attack. Emily recognized the signs instantly. Without thinking, she stepped directly into his path, forcing him to stop. "Alexander," she said firmly. "Look at me." His eyes found hers, desperate and vulnerable in a way she'd never witnessed. This was the man behind the machine, terrified of losing control. "Count with me," she instructed. "5 things you can see." "This isn't in the protocol," he objected, his voice strained. "We're creating a new one," Emily said, her voice gentle but leaving no room for argument. 5 things. Now. Slowly, she talked him through the grounding technique she'd used during her mother's worst pain episodes. As his breathing steadied, Emily became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the subtle scent of his cologne, of how his gaze had shifted from panic to something much more difficult to name. "How did you know what to do?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated. "Because I understand what it feels like when the world becomes too much." Something profound passed between them in that moment, a recognition of kindred damage, differently expressed but equally real. When Alexander's hand reached for hers, the touch was electric with unspoken possibility. The server crisis was resolved by dawn, but something fundamental had shifted. Alexander had allowed someone to see behind his carefully constructed walls, and Emily had glimpsed the wounded humanity beneath his controlled exterior. Neither knew what to do with this new, fragile understanding. The morning Emily didn't appear for work, Alexander felt her absence like a physical ache. 2 hours passed with no message, no explanation, a disruption to the routine they'd established over the past 2 months. His calls went straight to voicemail. By noon, his OCD had spiraled into overdrive, his mind creating increasingly catastrophic scenarios. When his private investigator called, the news was worse than he'd imagined. Emily's mother had taken a turn for the worse. The experimental treatment they'd been counting on had been denied by insurance, deemed too experimental and not cost-effective. Emily had emptied her savings account that morning. Without conscious decision, Alexander found himself standing in the sterile hallway of Metro General Hospital, feeling more out of place than he ever had in his meticulously controlled life. When he found Emily's room, he froze in the doorway. She sat beside her unconscious mother's bed, holding a frail hand, her face drawn with grief and exhaustion. She looked up, shock registering through her tears. "Alexander? What are you?" "I fixed it," he interrupted, his words awkward and rushed. "This wasn't in any protocol." "The treatment. The hospital board received an anonymous donation specifically for cases like your mother's." He swallowed hard. "It's done." Emily stood slowly, disbelief warring with hope. "Why would you do this?" Alexander struggled, words failing him. How could he explain that her absence had thrown his entire world into chaos? That in 2 short months, she had become essential to his functioning in ways his logical mind couldn't process? "Because you matter," he finally said, the simplicity of the truth terrifying him. "You matter to me." When Emily stepped toward him, Alexander instinctively backed away. Physical contact outside of strict parameters still triggered his anxiety. Understanding immediately, she stopped. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes conveying what words couldn't. Alexander nodded stiffly, already feeling exposed and vulnerable. I should go. You have my number if you need anything else. He turned to leave, retreat being his safest option. Alexander, Emily called after him. When he paused without turning, she continued. My mother's birthday is next week. I'm making her favorite dinner at home. Nothing fancy. Would you like to come? The invitation hung in the air between them, a bridge to a world Alexander had always avoided. Messy. Unpredictable. Human. Everything that terrified him. Text me the details, he finally said, still facing away. I'll check my schedule. They both knew his schedule was entirely at his own discretion. The Meridian Tower Charity Gala was Alexander's most dreaded annual event, hundreds of people, unpredictable interactions, and countless opportunities for his carefully maintained facade to crack. This year, however, he had Emily beside him, elegantly dressed in a gown he'd insisted on purchasing after she'd accepted her promotion to executive assistant. The Henderson Group is approaching at your 4 o'clock, Emily murmured discreetly. Their CFO still wants to discuss the merger terms. 7-minute conversation maximum, then we transition to the East Bar where the Richards Foundation donors are gathering. Alexander nodded almost imperceptibly, gratitude in his eyes. Emily had transformed his social obligations from endurance tests to manageable challenges through her meticulous preparation and subtle cues. The evening progressed smoothly until Emily excused herself briefly. In her absence, Alexander was cornered by James Whitfield, a notorious corporate raider with a vendetta against Harrington Enterprises. Must be convenient having such a devoted assistant, Whitfield remarked, his smile not reaching his eyes. Though I wonder if she'd be quite so attentive if she knew about Caracas. Alexander's blood turned cold. Caracas was buried deep, a dark chapter from 5 years ago when his OCD and perfectionism had driven him to extremes that had cost people their livelihoods. Miss Lewis is not part of this conversation, Alexander replied, his voice dangerously controlled. Whitfield leaned closer. I've made her part of it. An interesting email was sent to her personal account this morning, with quite comprehensive documentation. I wonder what she'll think of the real Alexander Harrington. Before Alexander could respond, Emily returned to his side, immediately sensing the tension. Mr. Whitfield, she greeted politely. I believe your wife was looking for you by the champagne fountain. After Whitfield departed with a knowing smirk, Emily turned to Alexander. What happened? Alexander's mind raced. If Whitfield's threat was real, Emily would soon discover one of his darkest chapters, a time when his obsession with perfection had led him to systematically dismantle a competing company, leaving hundreds jobless and several lives ruined. It had been legally impeccable but morally bankrupt. We need to leave, he said abruptly. In the sanctuary of his penthouse, Alexander paced while Emily watched with growing concern. Finally, he stopped. There are things about me you don't know, he began, his voice hollow. Things I've done in the name of success and control. Emily's expression remained steady. I know about Caracas, Alexander. He stared at her, stunned. How? I'm your assistant. I have access to virtually everything. I found the records 3 weeks after I started working for you. Her eyes held his without judgment. I also found the anonymous trust fund you established for the affected families, the scholarship program, the rebuilding initiatives. Alexander felt exposed in a way no business rival had ever managed. The remediation doesn't erase the damage. No, Emily agreed. It doesn't. But it shows something you never let anyone see, that you understand the cost of your actions and you're trying to make amends. She moved closer, carefully telegraphing her approach. The man I've come to know these past months isn't just his worst mistakes or his mental health challenges. He's brilliant and damaged and trying, in his own way, to be better. Alexander felt something crumbling inside him, walls he'd maintained for decades giving way. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, gesturing vaguely between them. Any of this. People. Feelings. Connection without control. Emily smiled softly. I know. That's why we're taking it one protocol at a time. When she slowly extended her hand, giving him the choice to take it or not, Alexander hesitated only briefly before reaching back. Their fingers intertwined, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Harrington chose uncertainty over control. 1 year later, Emily stood in Alexander's office, now their office, reviewing the final plans for the Harrington Foundation's newest initiative, a comprehensive mental health program for high-achieving professionals struggling with anxiety disorders and OCD. The board unanimously approved the funding, she reported, watching Alexander adjust his perfectly aligned desk items with practiced precision. Some things hadn't changed. Others had transformed entirely. And your mother's latest scans? He asked, looking up from his work. Emily's smile was radiant. 6 months cancer-free. Alexander nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. He still struggled with direct emotional expressions, but Emily had learned to read the depth in his gestures. The slight relaxation of his shoulders. The micro-smile that others would miss entirely. We should celebrate, he said, checking his watch. I've reserved time in my schedule between 7 o'clock and 9:30 p.m. Emily laughed. How romantic. Has anyone ever told you that you have a way with words, Mr. Harrington? Only you, he replied, his tone dry but his eyes warm. And repeatedly. As they gathered their things to leave, Alexander paused, his expression growing serious. I had my therapist adjust my exposure therapy protocols yesterday. Emily looked at him curiously. They had agreed early in their relationship that his therapy was his private domain unless he chose to share. From his pocket, Alexander withdrew a small velvet box, precisely centered on his palm. This involves a significant deviation from my comfort with uncertainty, he said, his clinical tone belied by the slight tremor in his hands. Emily's breath caught as she understood. I can't promise perfection, Alexander continued, his voice steadier than she'd expected. I will have difficult days. My mind will always work differently. But I've calculated every variable, and the conclusion is irrefutable. He opened the box, revealing a stunning emerald ring. My life functions better with you in it. In every measurable and immeasurable way. It wasn't the most conventional proposal, but to Emily, it was perfect in its authenticity. This was Alexander, brilliant, damaged, evolving, and utterly genuine in his love, expressed in the only language he fully trusted, truth. Are you calculating the probability of my answer right now? She asked softly, tears gathering in her eyes. Attempting to and failing spectacularly, he admitted. Emily stepped forward, cupping his face in her hands, a touch that once would have sent him spiraling now brought comfort. Yes, she whispered. The answer is yes. As Alexander carefully slipped the ring onto her finger, after discreetly wiping it with an antibacterial cloth, Emily realized how far they'd both come. She had found security and purpose after years of desperate struggle. He had discovered that control and connection weren't mutually exclusive. I love you, Alexander said, the word still new on his tongue but growing more natural with practice. Precisely as you are. In the gleaming glass tower where they'd first collided, she exhausted and desperate, he rigid and alone, they had found something neither had believed possible, a love that didn't demand perfection, only presence. A love measured not in flawlessness but in understanding. A love built protocol by protocol, day by day, challenge by challenge. It wasn't perfect. It was better than that. It was real.